The Polaroid in my hand feels heavier with every second that passes, its image faded by time. 6 children, dressed in their Sunday best, stand frozen before the old Hollis family home in Blackwood Hollow. Their faces are captured in time, some smiling, others solemn, as if they already understood the fate that awaited them. I am the only one left. My name is Eleanor Hollis, and I am the last of my line. That I turned 32 last month is something of a miracle in my family. For over a century, you see, the Hollis children have vanished without a trace before their 10th birthday. All of them, except for me. My life has been haunted by the ghosts of siblings I can barely remember and cousins I never had the chance to meet. Their disappearances span decades, each one as inexplicable as the last. No evidence, no bodies, no closure. Just empty beds and grieving parents and the whispers of a curse that will not die. 4 years, I have kept silent about what I know, about what happened. But the nightmares have returned, and with them, the feeling of something watching me from the shadows. I cannot outrun this any longer. Perhaps by telling my story, I can finally break the chains that have bound my family for generations. This is not a ghost story. This is something far worse. This is the truth about the Hollis family, and the reason I am the only child who survived. The story begins, as most tragedies do, with an act of greed. It was 1897 when my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Hollis, arrived in Blackwood Hollow seeking his fortune. In most respects, the small New England town was unremarkable, but it sat at the edge of dense woodlands rumored to be rich with resources left untapped. Thomas was a businessman with a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter who stood in his way. The locals tried to warn him about the forest. They spoke of ancient treaties with those who dwell beyond the stone circle, of boundaries that must never be crossed. But Thomas dismissed their superstitions as the ramblings of simple country folk. He purchased 300 acres of woodland and began clearing the trees, his mind set on building a lumber empire. The first disappearance happened just weeks after the first axe bit into the old-growth forest. Thomas's 5-year-old son, William, vanished from his bed one autumn night. 4 days, the entire town searched, but not a single trace of the boy was ever found. Some claimed to have heard strange, high-pitched whistling from the woods that night, but the authorities dismissed such accounts. Grief-stricken yet undeterred, Thomas continued his business ventures. In the years that followed, his wife gave birth to 3 more children. By some cruel twist of fate, each child vanished before their 10th birthday. Always at night, always without a witness, always without a trace. The pattern had been established. You might be wondering why I am telling you all this, I say to the camera, setting down the leather-bound journal that holds our family history. Why dredge up a century of tragedy? Because the disappearances never stopped. They continued with each new generation of the Hollis family. My grandparents lost 2 children. My parents lost 3. And I lost everyone I loved. I closed my eyes, their faces coming back to me. James, the oldest, who taught me how to ride a bike. Meredith, who could spend hours creating elaborate stories with her dolls. And little Thomas, named for our infamous ancestor, who never made it past his 4th birthday. James was the first to go, I continue, my voice barely steady. He was 9 years old, just a few months shy of his 10th birthday. I was only 4 at the time. But some memories burn themselves into your mind, no matter how young you are. It was a warm June evening in 1997. Our parents had taken us for ice cream after dinner, a rare treat that had left us sticky-fingered and giggling. James and I shared a bedroom then, with twin beds on opposite walls. I remember him telling me to stop kicking my feet against the mattress as we settled in for the night. "Go to sleep, Ellie," he had mumbled, already half dreaming. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. I woke sometime in the night to a strange sound, like wind chimes made of bone, delicate and discordant. Through half-lidded eyes, I saw that James's bed was bathed in an odd, greenish light that seemed to seep through the window. I thought I was dreaming as I watched dark, spindly shapes move around his bed. These figures weren't quite human, too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at impossible angles. James never screamed, never called out. He simply rose from his bed, his eyes wide but unseeing, and walked toward the window. I tried to call his name, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as if some invisible force held me in place. The window opened on its own, though there was no breeze. James climbed out, following the twisted shadows. The last thing I saw was his pajama-clad form silhouetted against that sickly green light before he vanished into the darkness. By the time I found my voice and screamed for my parents, James was already gone. The police searched for weeks. They dragged the nearby lake, combed the woods with cadaver dogs, questioned every resident in town. Nothing. It was as if James had simply ceased to exist. My parents were devastated, but they were resolved to keep our family together. Lightning doesn't strike twice, my father would say, though his eyes held a fear he could not hide. He was wrong, of course. 2 years later, Meredith disappeared. She was 7, a bright-eyed girl with wild curls and an even wilder imagination. After James vanished, my parents had installed state-of-the-art security systems, motion sensors, window alarms, even a guard dog named Rex. None of it mattered. On the night Meredith disappeared, every electronic device in our house failed simultaneously. The security system, the phones, even battery-operated flashlights, all went dead. And Rex, our loyal German shepherd, was found cowering in the laundry room, whimpering and inconsolable. I shared a room with Meredith after James was gone. I remember waking to that same bone chime sound, that same greenish light. This time, I forced myself to sit up, to fight against the paralysis threatening to overtake me. "Meredith," I whispered urgently. "Meredith, wake up." But she was already standing beside her bed, swaying slightly as if in a trance. The shadows gathered around her, their elongated fingers gently brushing her hair. I caught glimpses of their faces, if you could call them faces. They had no eyes that I could see, just deep, hollow indentations where eyes should be, and thin, lipless mouths that stretched too wide across their features. "Don't go with them," I cried out, finally breaking free of my paralysis. I lunged for my sister, but an invisible barrier stopped me, like hitting a wall of ice-cold glass. Meredith turned toward me, and for a brief moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. "They say I have to go, Ellie," she said, her voice oddly calm. "They've been calling me for a long time." "Who?" I demanded, pounding against the invisible barrier. "Who's calling you?" But Meredith only smiled, a serene expression that didn't belong on a child's face. "The Whistlers. They live in the in-between places. They've always been there, watching us." Then she turned and walked toward the window, which opened soundlessly to receive her. The shadowy figures enveloped her, and together they faded into the night. By the time my parents reached our room, responding to my screams, Meredith was gone. The window was locked from the inside. The alarms, when power returned an hour later, showed no signs of having been triggered. My parents moved us after that. We left Blackwood Hollow and the ancestral Hollis home behind, relocating to a suburban neighborhood 3 states away. They changed our last name. They cut ties with remaining family members. They did everything they could to outrun the curse. It found us anyway. Thomas Jr. was born 2 years after we moved. My parents were hesitant to have another child, but the doctors had told my mother that Meredith would likely be her last chance at pregnancy. Thomas was an unexpected blessing and ultimately, another victim. He was the sweetest of us all, with dimpled cheeks and a laugh that could brighten the darkest room. I was 9 when he was born, old enough to help care for him, to become his protector. I took that role seriously, especially as he approached his 4th birthday. I had begun to understand the pattern by then, to recognize the danger that loomed over our family. I insisted on sleeping in Thomas's room. I researched protective symbols and lined his windowsill with salt, iron nails, and other wards I'd read about. I kept a journal of any unusual occurrences, cold spots, electronic glitches, strange sounds in the night. I was determined that what happened to James and Meredith would not happen to Thomas. For 3 years and 11 months, my vigilance seemed to work. Thomas remained safe, growing into a curious, vibrant little boy who loved dinosaurs and could spend hours building elaborate structures with his blocks. 3 weeks before his 4th birthday, I fell ill with a severe case of pneumonia. After 2 days of trying to care for me at home, my parents admitted me to the hospital. I begged them not to leave Thomas. I tried to explain about the curse, about what I'd seen take James and Meredith. They attributed my ravings to the high fever and assured me that Thomas would be fine. I spent 5 days in that hospital bed, consumed with dread. When my parents finally came to take me home, I knew from their hollow eyes and ashen faces what had happened before they said a word. Thomas had vanished from his bedroom 3 nights earlier. The doors were locked, the windows secured. The new security cameras my father had installed showed nothing, just static for 3 crucial minutes in the middle of the night. When the image cleared, Thomas's bed was empty. I'm not telling you this to sensationalize my family's tragedy, I say to the camera, wiping away tears I hadn't realized were falling. I'm telling you because I need to understand why I was spared. Why, out of all the Hollis children across 5 generations, am I the only one who lived past my 10th birthday? I take a deep breath, steadying myself before continuing. After Thomas disappeared, something in my parents broke. My mother took her own life 6 months later. My father turned to alcohol, becoming a shell of the man he once was. He died in a single-car accident when I was 16, though I've always wondered if it was really an accident at all. I became a ward of the state, bouncing between foster homes until I aged out of the system. I put myself through college, built a career, created a life that looked normal from the outside. But inside, the questions never stopped. The nightmares never faded. Why was I different? What made me special? Or was it just that my time hadn't come yet? I spent years researching my family's history, I tell the viewers, pulling out a stack of documents, birth certificates, death records, newspaper clippings about the disappearances. I traced the pattern back through the decades, looking for exceptions, for clues, for anything that might explain what happened. The pattern was consistent, but not without variations. Some generations lost all their children, others lost only some. In a few cases, children disappeared as young as 2. In others, they vanished just days before their 10th birthday, as if something was toying with the family's hopes. One detail stood out. In each generation, the disappearances began after a child had seen or experienced something in the woods behind the original Hollis property. James had gone mushroom hunting with our father a week before he vanished. Meredith had claimed to hear singing from the trees while playing in our backyard. And though we'd moved away from Blackwood Hollow before Thomas was born, my parents had taken us back to visit my grandmother when Thomas was 3. He had wandered off during a family picnic, only to be found 20 minutes later at the edge of those woods, talking animatedly to someone no one else could see. There's something in those woods, I say, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. Something that's been watching my family for generations. Something that takes the children who can see it. Which brought me to the question that had haunted me for decades. Had I never seen it, or had it never seen me? 2 months ago, I received a letter from a law firm in Blackwood Hollow. My great-aunt Judith, the last Hollis to live in the ancestral home, had passed away at the age of 94. To my surprise, she had left everything to me, the house, the property, and what remained of the family fortune. I hadn't known Judith well. She was something of a recluse, a childless widow who had outlived all her siblings. After I was orphaned, she had sent birthday cards with modest checks, but we'd never spoken directly. Now, I wondered if her bequest was more than mere generosity, if perhaps she had known something about our family's curse that she wanted me to discover. I decided to return to Blackwood Hollow, I explained, to the place where it all began. If I was ever going to understand what happened to my siblings, to all the Hollis children, I needed to confront our history directly. The Hollis house stood at the end of a winding driveway, partially hidden by ancient oak trees. It was a Victorian monstrosity, 3 stories of weathered grey stone with a slate roof and too many windows, like a multitude of watchful eyes. It had been well maintained despite its age, a testament to Judith's care, or perhaps to something more unsettling, as if the house itself wanted to endure. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. The real estate agent who handed over the keys seemed eager to leave, mentioning something about meeting another client. As his car disappeared down the driveway, I stood alone before my inheritance, feeling the weight of generations pressing down upon me. The interior was exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits. Dark wood paneling, ornate crown molding, Antique furniture draped with white sheets like ghosts frozen in time. The air smelled of furniture polish and old books, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite identify, something earthy and ancient. I spent that first day exploring, reacquainting myself with the house's labyrinthine layout. The library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the conservatory, its windows clouded with dust but still allowing dappled light to illuminate the dead plants within, the formal dining room where generations of Hollises had gathered for meals, unaware of the fate awaiting their children. As twilight fell, I found myself drawn to the third floor, to a small room at the end of the hallway that had once belonged to Judith. It was spartanly furnished, a narrow bed, a writing desk, a wardrobe, but it was what covered the walls that caught my attention. Hundreds of news clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes, all connected by red string like some elaborate crime board. Judith had been conducting her own investigation into the family curse. I spent hours poring over her research. She had documented every disappearance, noting similarities and discrepancies. She had interviewed townspeople, collected local legends, even consulted with paranormal experts. And she had focused particularly on the woods, the 300 acres that Thomas Hollis had purchased all those years ago. According to Judith's notes, those woods had been sacred to the indigenous people who once lived in the region. They believed it to be a thin place, a location where the boundary between our world and another was permeable. They had erected stone markers to warn people away from certain areas and performed regular rituals to appease what they called the Watchers between worlds. When Thomas Hollis began clearing the forest for lumber, he had destroyed several of these markers. Within a week, strange phenomena began occurring. Workers reported hearing whistling sounds with no source, seeing impossible shadows, feeling watched by unseen eyes. Then the disappearances started. Not just William Hollis, but 3 of the lumberman's children as well. The most disturbing part of Judith's research was a series of drawings, childish sketches collected from Hollis children over the decades. Each depicted the same spindly, elongated figures I had seen taking James and Meredith, the Whistlers, as Meredith had called them. At the center of Judith's crime board was a map of the property, with a location deep in the woods marked with a red X beside it, a note in Judith's shaky handwriting, the original stone circle. The doorway. They come through here. A chill ran down my spine as I studied the map. Could this be it? The source of the curse? The reason generations of Hollis children had vanished? I was still examining Judith's research when I heard it. The faint, distant sound of bone chimes carried on the night breeze. My blood froze. It was the same sound that had preceded James and Meredith's disappearances. Moving to the window, I peered out into the darkness. At the edge of the woods, barely visible in the moonlight, stood a figure too tall, too thin, its limbs bent at unnatural angles as it raised what appeared to be a hand in greeting. It knew I was here. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered fleeing, packing my bags and driving away, leaving Blackwood Hollow and its horrors behind forever. But where would I go? The curse had found my family before, even states away. And now I was so close to answers. No, I decided. I wouldn't run. Not this time. I spent a sleepless night in Judith's room, surrounded by her research, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. When dawn finally broke, I made my decision. I would follow Judith's map to the stone circle. I would confront whatever waited there. But first, I needed to understand why I had survived when no other Hollis child had. What made me different? I returned to Judith's crime board, examining it with fresh eyes. Among the photographs and news clippings was a family tree, meticulously detailed with birth dates, death dates, and notes about disappearances. I traced my lineage back through the generations, looking for patterns, for anomalies. And then I saw it, a detail so obvious I couldn't believe I'd missed it. Every Hollis child who had disappeared was a direct blood descendant of Thomas Hollis. Every single one. But I wasn't. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone and opened the photo album. There, among the few family pictures I'd managed to salvage after my parents' deaths, was one taken on my 4th birthday. I zoomed in on my father's face, then looked up at a portrait of Thomas Hollis that hung in the hallway. There was no resemblance. None at all. The truth, I say to the camera, my voice scarcely above a whisper, was both simpler and more devastating than I could have imagined. I wasn't spared because of some special protection or divine intervention. I was spared because I wasn't a Hollis by blood. The evidence had been there all along, if only I'd been willing to see it. The arguments I'd overheard between my parents after James disappeared. The way my mother couldn't look at me in the months after Meredith was taken. The offhand comment from a great-uncle at a family reunion, "Doesn't look much like her father, does she?" I wasn't my father's biological daughter. I was the product of an affair, carried into the Hollis family under false pretenses. And somehow, whatever took the Hollis children, these whistlers, they knew. They could sense the bloodline, or the lack thereof. I should have felt relieved, I continue, knowing that I wasn't bound by the curse, that I wasn't marked for disappearance like my siblings. Instead, I felt a strange sense of guilt. Why should I have been spared when they weren't? Why should I live when they were taken? But mixed with the guilt was a newfound determination. If I wasn't at risk, then I could do what no Hollis by blood had ever been able to do. I could venture into the woods, find the stone circle, and perhaps discover what had happened to the lost children. I could seek justice, or at least answers. The next morning, armed with Judith's map, a backpack of supplies, and a steely resolve, I set out into the woods behind the Hollis house. The October air was crisp, the forest ablaze with autumn colors. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. I followed a barely there path that wound between ancient trees. The farther I ventured, the older the forest seemed to become. The trees grew larger, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The underbrush thinned, giving way to a carpet of moss that muffled my footsteps. The air grew still, the normal sounds of the forest birdsong, rustling leaves, skittering animals fading into an unnatural silence. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing. In its center stood a circle of standing stones, each about 4 feet tall, weathered by centuries of exposure. They weren't impressive like Stonehenge, just simple, rough-hewn monoliths arranged in a perfect circle about 20 feet in diameter. But there was something unsettling about them, an energy that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. I approached cautiously, consulting Judith's notes. According to her research, the stones had been placed there by the indigenous people as markers, warnings to stay away from what they believed was a doorway between worlds. Thomas Hollis had ordered most of the stone circles on his property destroyed. But this one, deep in the woods and away from the prime lumber areas, had somehow survived. As I stepped closer, I noticed symbols carved into each stone. Spirals, concentric circles, strange angular figures that reminded me of the Whistler's elongated forms. At the center of the circle was a flat stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I desperately hoped wasn't blood. I circled the stones, taking photographs, comparing them to Judith's notes. According to her research, the disappearances were connected to celestial events, specific alignments of stars and planets that created moments when the boundary between worlds grew thin. The next such alignment was... I checked the astronomical chart in Judith's notes, then looked at my phone's date. Tonight. The next alignment was tonight. A part of me wanted to leave immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place before nightfall. But a stronger part knew this might be my only chance to understand what had happened to my siblings, to all the Hollis children. I decided to wait. As the sun began its descent, I set up a small camp at the edge of the clearing, just outside the stone circle. I had brought food, water, a flashlight, and most importantly, a video camera. Whatever happened tonight, I would document it. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. I reviewed Judith's notes again and again, looking for anything that might prepare me for what was to come. According to her research, the Whistlers were not ghosts or demons in the traditional sense. They were entities from another dimension, one that occasionally overlapped with our own at specific locations and times. They were drawn to children, specifically Hollis children, because of the debt incurred by Thomas Hollis when he violated their sacred space and destroyed their markers. A life for a life, a child for each stone destroyed. But the debt should have been paid many times over by now. Why did they continue to take Hollis children, generation after generation? The answer, buried in Judith's most speculative notes, chilled me to the bone. She believed the whistlers didn't just take the children, they transformed them, made them into something like themselves. And those transformed children, still bearing some memory of their human lives, were the ones who returned to claim their young relatives, perpetuating the cycle of disappearance. Which meant that James, Meredith, and little Thomas might still exist in some form. They might even be the ones to step through the doorway tonight. Darkness fell with unsettling suddenness, as if the night had been waiting impatiently to reclaim the forest. I turned on my flashlight and the video camera, positioning them both to capture the stone circle. Then I waited, every nerve in my body alive with anticipation and dread. The bone chimes came first, that delicate, discordant sound that had haunted my nightmares for decades. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in my bones rather than reaching my ears. Then came the whistling, high-pitched and melodic, like wind through a cracked window, but with a deliberateness that suggested language. It rose and fell in patterns that almost made sense, as if I could understand if I just listened hard enough. The air within the stone circle began to shimmer, like heat rising from pavement on a summer day. The space between the stones seemed to warp and bend, reality itself becoming malleable. And then, stepping through this distortion, came the whistlers. 3 of them, their elongated bodies moving with a grace that defied their impossible proportions. I shrank back against a tree, fighting the urge to flee. These were the creatures that had taken my siblings. These were the entities that had cursed my family for generations. And now they were here, mere feet away, separated from me only by the boundary of the stone circle. They moved about the circle, touching the stones with their long, spindly fingers, leaving faint luminescent trails that glowed a sickly green. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, their movements deliberate and synchronized. Their whistling grew louder, more complex, building to a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. And then they stopped, all at once, and turned toward me. I couldn't see their eyes, just those deep hollow indentations, but I felt their gaze like a physical weight. For a long moment, we regarded each other across the boundary of the circle. Predator and prey, locked in silent confrontation. Then one of them spoke, its lipless mouth barely moving. "Eleanor," it said, its voice like dry leaves rustling across pavement. "We have been waiting for you." I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, amazed that my voice didn't tremble. "Nothing," it replied. "You are not of the bloodline. You are not ours to take." "But my siblings were," I said, anger flaring through my fear. "James, Meredith, Thomas, they were innocent children." "As were we," said another of the creatures, its voice higher, almost childlike. With a shock of recognition, I realized it was speaking with Meredith's voice. "Before your ancestor broke the covenant, the 3rd whistler stepped forward, and when it spoke, I heard James in its otherworldly tones, 'We are the price of his transgression. The debt must be paid.'" "But why?" I cried, tears streaming down my face. "Why continue this for generations? Hasn't enough been paid?" "The covenant was broken," said the first whistler. "The markers destroyed, the doorway left open. We come through because we must. We take because it is the way." "Then I'll rebuild the markers," I said desperately. "I'll close the doorway. Just give them back. Please." The whistlers conferred among themselves, their whistling language incomprehensible to my human ears. Finally, the one with Meredith's voice turned back to me. "It is too late for those already taken," it said. "They are as we are now. Between worlds. Neither here nor there. But the cycle can be broken." "How?" I asked, hope kindling within me. "Tell me how to end this." "Return the sacred items," said the James whistler. "Rebuild the markers. Seal the doorway." "What sacred items?" I asked, confused. "The stones that were taken," said the first whistler. "The heart of each marker that your ancestor destroyed. He kept them as trophies. They must be returned to their places." I thought of the old Hollis house, of its many rooms filled with generations of collected items. Could those stones still be there, somewhere among the family heirlooms? "If I do this," I said carefully, "if I return the stones and rebuild the markers, will you release the children? Will you let them go?" The whistlers were silent for a long moment. Then, in unison, they replied, "We cannot undo what has been done, but no more will be taken. The debt will be paid." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the only one I was going to get. My siblings, all the Hollis children, were gone, transformed into these otherworldly entities. But I could stop more from being taken. I could end the curse. "I'll do it," I promised. "I'll find the stones. I'll rebuild the markers." The whistlers nodded in unison, a gesture so human it made my heart ache. Then, one by one, they turned and stepped back through the shimmering air at the center of the circle, disappearing from our reality. All except the one with Meredith's voice. She lingered at the edge of the distortion. "Ellie," she said softly, and for a moment I could almost see my sister beneath the otherworldly form. "It doesn't hurt, being this way. We're not suffering. I promise." Then she, too, was gone, and I was alone in the clearing, the stone circle dark and silent once more. I returned to the Hollis house at dawn, exhausted but determined. I had a mission now. Find the sacred stones. Rebuild the markers. Seal the doorway. End the curse once and for all. It took me 3 days of searching through the house, opening every drawer, checking every hidden compartment, examining every family heirloom. I found them eventually in a locked chest in the attic, wrapped in velvet cloth and labeled in Thomas Hollis's handwriting, "Curiosities from the Indian Circle." There were 7 stones in all, each about the size of my fist, carved with the same symbols I had seen on the standing stones in the forest. They were made of a strange, dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Holding them made my skin prickle, as if they emanated some subtle energy. Following Judith's notes and the instructions from the whistlers, I spent the next week rebuilding the markers. It was painstaking work, requiring me to locate the remnants of the destroyed stone circles based on old property maps and then reconstruct them using the sacred stones as centerpieces. As I worked, I felt watched, not menacingly, but attentively. Sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I would glimpse elongated shadows among the trees or hear faint whistling on the breeze. The whistlers were monitoring my progress, ensuring I fulfilled my end of the bargain. Finally, all that remained was to seal the doorway at the original stone circle. According to Judith's research, this required a ritual to be performed at moonrise on the night of the next alignment, 2 weeks from my encounter with the whistlers. I prepared carefully, following the instructions in Judith's notes and my own intuition. When the night arrived, I returned to the stone circle, carrying the final sacred stone and the items needed for the ritual: salt, iron filings, sage, and a small vial of my own blood. The forest was eerily silent as I approached the clearing. The stones stood as they had before, ancient sentinels guarding a doorway between worlds. I could feel the energy building as moonrise approached, a tension in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. I began the ritual, sprinkling salt and iron in a precise pattern around the circle, burning sage, and chanting the words Judith had transcribed from an old indigenous text. As the moon cleared the horizon, bathing the clearing in silver light, I placed the final sacred stone on the altar at the center of the circle and let 7 drops of my blood fall upon it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the stone began to glow with an inner light, not the sickly green of the whistlers, but a warm, golden radiance that spread to the other stones in the circle. The air shimmered, much as it had when the whistlers appeared. But instead of opening wider, the distortion seemed to be closing, like a wound healing. From within this closing doorway came a chorus of whistling, dozens, perhaps hundreds of voices joining together in what could only be described as a song of farewell. And among them, I could swear I heard the laughter of children of James, Meredith, and Thomas saying goodbye. Then the light faded, the whistling silenced, and the forest was still once more. But something had changed. The oppressive energy that had permeated the clearing was gone, replaced by a sense of peace, of completion. The doorway was sealed. The covenant restored. The debt paid. I can't prove what happened in those woods, I say to the camera, my voice steady despite the emotions welling within me. I have the video I recorded, but it shows little more than shadows and strange lights. Nothing that would convince a skeptic. What I do have is this: in the years since I sealed the doorway, not a single child has disappeared from Blackwood Hollow or the surrounding counties, and the nightmares that plagued me for decades have finally stopped. I pick up the faded Polaroid of the 6 Hollis children, my siblings and cousins, all long gone. I couldn't save them, I admit. I couldn't bring them back. But I could ensure they were the last. That no more children would be taken to pay a debt they never incurred. I look directly into the camera, my gaze unflinching. The Hollis family curse is broken. The Whistlers have returned to their world, and the doorway between our realities is closed. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can hear distant whistling from the woods, not menacing, but melancholy, a reminder of what was lost and what was gained. I set down the photograph and glance toward the window, where twilight is gathering. I still live in the old Hollis house. I've renovated it, opened it up to light and life again. And I've started the adoption process. There's a little girl, 8 years old, who needs a home. The social worker was concerned about placing her with me, given my family history. Every child in the Hollis family vanished before age 10, she said. Except you. A smile touches my lips for the first time. I told her not to worry. The curse is broken. This house will be filled with children's laughter again. Children who will grow up, grow old, live full lives. That's my promise to James, Meredith, and Thomas. That's how I honor their memory. I reach forward to turn off the camera, but pause, one last thought occurring to me. If you're watching this, and you have old, unresolved family stories, unexplained disappearances, generational curses, bargains made by ancestors long dead, don't dismiss them as mere superstition. Some debts must be paid. Some covenants must be honored. Some doors should remain closed. I lean closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. And if you ever find yourself in the woods at twilight, and hear a sound like bone chimes on the breeze, or high, melodic whistling from between the trees, run. Run and don't look back. Because not all the doorways have been sealed. Not all the whistlers have gone home. The camera goes dark, but the whistling lingers, soft, distant, and unmistakably inhuman.